Good morning, everyone. My name is Rohan Hyatt. I'm one of the editors-in-chief of Animal Law Review, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our next panel, Advancing Equity in Animal Advocacy with Shayna Rowbotham. Shayna is the Senior Organizing Manager for the United States at the international animal protection nonprofit Mercy for Animals. She also serves as the board chair of Encompass, a nonprofit working to make the animal protection movement more racially diverse, equitable, and inclusive. Her work is largely centered on expanding and growing the capacity of the animal protection movement through cultivating community, developing leaders, and organizing for action. She has also supported the success of volunteer programs in Canada, Brazil, and Latin America, and mentored young adult activists through advocacy-based internship and fellowship programs. Finally, she recently studied effective organizing under Marshall Gantz at the Harvard Kennedy School. Please join me in welcoming Shayna.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm just going to start sharing my screen here for our presentation. So hopefully you can all see that. Feel free to give me a thumbs up if you can, Rohan. Okay. So thank you everyone for being here with us today. I'm really excited to explore this year's theme of progress and perseverance as it relates to advancing equity in animal advocacy. So as was mentioned, my name's Shayna, and through my roles at Mercy for Animals and Encompass, I'm often considering how we can build a stronger, more effective animal protection movement in a way that does center diversity, equity, and inclusion, or in short, DEI. So today, as we explore this topic, we'll talk a little bit about why we should apply an equity lens to all that we do, whether that's related to how we're building equity for the people within our movement, or how we direct this towards our outward-facing work and programs. I'll cover some examples of the progress that we've made, and I actually really want to invite you to reflect on other progress you've noticed in our spaces as well. A lot of what I'll share is just specific to my own work and experience and things that I've seen. And while we've seen DEI work being prioritized more and more by individuals and organizations in our spaces, there is still tremendous opportunity and a dire need to continue on this path. So I'll share some recommendations for where individuals and organizations can start based on a State of the Movement report that was released by Encompass and Equity-Based Dialogue for Inclusion earlier this year. And lastly, but arguably most importantly, I hope that joining this session serves as an opportunity for each of you to really start reflecting on why equity matters to you, what progress you've witnessed, and what you think the path forward can look like. And so my hope is that this will result in a continued commitment to prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in your own lives, whether that's personally or professionally. So as we get started, I'd like to actually start by sharing a little bit more about myself. And the first thing I want to say is that I am by no means an authority or expert in DEI. And I'm not a professionally or academically trained practitioner in this field, but I am someone who is passionate about animal advocacy work. I care deeply about animals, people, our planet, and I'm also driven by the desire to do good in our world. So as such, I'm someone who wants the animal protection movement to be as effective as possible. And I imagine many of you share these values. So as a way to do that, over the last few years, I've been focusing on strengthening my DEI practice and, have at times, I think like many people, struggled with the fear of saying the wrong thing or making a bad decision or worrying about how others might perceive me or any missteps that I make. And, it sounds a little cliche, but what I've come to realize is that, everything is a learning curve and some are more steep than others, but it oftentimes just starts with showing up. And in 2020, one of the things I decided to show up for was contributing a piece to the Encompass essays, which was a collection of essays written by farmed animal protection advocates who are really committed to DEIJ work in our movement. So after Encompass's founder and executive director, Ariana, emailed me with this invitation, I started composing a response right away. And as I was writing out my reply, I kind of realized I didn't know what I had to contribute to the topic. I started feeling like maybe I'm not knowledgeable enough, or I haven't done enough, or I haven't formalized my own thinking enough. And so I sent a really measured response saying that I was interested, but I sprinkled in a lot of apprehension so that I had an out if Ariana thought, maybe this isn't a good fit. And I had told her that, at the time I was kind of taking a backseat in the work participating in it, but not really driving things forward. And I wasn't really sure what I could bring in the form of new information or ideas. She actually wrote back pretty quickly, probed into that question and asked, why? Where is this coming from? And I think in that moment, I really had a choice, which was, how do I want to show up right now? Do I want to keep taking this backseat, just staring out the window to see where we're going? Or would I like to take an opportunity to step into the driver's seat and really choose where I can go and where we can go? And that meant moving through some of my own discomfort and fear to really amplify this work. So these are the questions I carried forward as I wrote my essay, exploring, where did these feelings come from? And so through the writing process, I had a pretty transformative experience and started understanding my own racial identity, my experiences in the farmed animal protection movement that I had never really come face to face with. And within the week, I finished my essay really building on that simple question. So today I've come to believe that it's really impossible for us to succeed in equity efforts and understanding if we haven't actually first really intimately and delicately dissected all of these thoughts, experiences, and actions, and importantly, our identities. So as we delve into this topic of equity today, I think that we should first start reflecting on how we show up in this space and how we want to show up. So I just want to ask each of you to take a moment to think about, what does that look like for you, and how do your identities impact how you show up in equity work? So for me, I'm here today and I'm in this work as someone who is a transnational and transracial adoptee. I was raised in a white family in a predominantly white middle-class neighborhood in my formative years. I'm Korean and I identify as Asian American. I'm able-bodied and I'm a cis woman. So my visible and invisible identities inform the privileges and lack of privileges I have and have had, and they really inform how I approach equity work. So simply checking in with ourselves about how we feel, understanding our privileges, but being okay driving without that map can really be a catalyst for transformative change in how we think about the application of equity work. And in spaces like the Animal Law Symposium, I think we have a great opportunity to really authentically engage in a community of practice together. So with that being said, I want to start in an important place, which is why. Why do we need to continue investing in equity work in our movement to become more effective? So when I consider this question, I often approach this from two different angles. So thinking about equity within the animal protection movement, and then in our outward facing work. And I think many of you may know that historically, the mainstream animal protection movement hasn't really prioritized DEI. So this means that we haven't really done all we can to create a space that attracts diverse groups of people and allows them to thrive. We do have the opportunity to change this narrative, which is great. So we know that studies have shown us at this point, a lot of us know that studies show that more diverse groups are smarter, more creative, insightful, effective, productive, and diverse groups experience lower rates of burnout and stronger feelings of belonging and engagement. And gosh, is that not like necessary to do this work that we're doing? And in addition to the lack of DEI efforts in our movement, much of our work has actually historically failed to engage the communities that are most impacted by factory farming. And so we've missed out on these opportunities to build an understanding of the interconnections of all these different forms of oppression, many of which are really linked to factory farming. So I think we find ourselves where we broadly speak about these connections between our issue and, say, the climate crisis or public health, but what we're not talking about is how BIPGM, or Black, Indigenous, and people of the global majority, experience the most negative impacts of climate change. Food apartheid, CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations, other human rights injustices, and so much more. These are all issues that are really deeply connected to animal agriculture. And so we're not setting up our work in a way that allows for us to address these issues collectively and at once. So I'm going to share a short video that touches on these interconnections and the opportunity to better address them in order to be more impactful. The video explores the concept of intersectional veganism in brief, but before playing this, I just want to take a quick moment to acknowledge that the term intersectional is often used in contexts that extend beyond the original intention. So as the video will share momentarily, Kimberly Crenshaw created the term to address the dual systems of gender and race back in 1989, and it was specifically used for Black women. Today, we see intersectionality often being used to explain just about any intersection of oppression. Some people say that this is a co-optation of white people to diverse the concept from its roots and reappropriate it in a way that serves white interests. So some groups like Encompass really try to stay away from using the term. Crenshaw has talked about being open to an evolution, but there is a risk of erasure in how the term is now being used because it can erase its original meaning, which was the oppression of Black women. So I just wanted to share that context up front before playing the video.
What does it mean to be an intersectional vegan? Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality in 1989. It is the idea that multiple aspects of a person's identity can contribute to both discrimination and privilege. As intersectional vegans, we see that the food system has many flaws and exploits both human and non-human animals throughout the world. We see the systems and structures that contribute to their suffering and how they overlap to create further harm. By acknowledging these issues and how they affect one another, we can improve the food system. Here are some examples of these intersections. Exploitation of slaughterhouse workers, environmental destruction caused by factory farms on meat processing plants, lack of healthy food option in communities of color, and long hours, horrendous conditions, and little pay for farm workers. To be an intersectional vegan means stopping cruelty to animals by supporting efforts to reduce suffering for human victims of our food system. Intersectional vegans believe that to end animal suffering, we must address these intersections. Together, we can create a compassionate food system and a compassionate world for everyone.
Looks like I have a weird little 1 second there. Okay. So we really need to reevaluate how we do our work and consider how we can address multiple forms of oppression, partly by calling ourselves and others in so we can learn how to do this in ways that support ongoing efforts and do not cause harm. Oh, I think maybe my screen share just ended here. 1 second, let me just pull that back up. Okay. Hopefully that's good. Someone let me know if it is not. So to summarize our why, increasing equity both within our movement and in our programs and other areas of work will both strengthen and grow our movement. It'll support and include impacted communities in our work, help the environment, and of course, more effectively help animals at the same time. So many individuals and organizations are in the process of doing this work. There's a lot of progress that we can celebrate and learn from. So as we look at progress, we'll take a look at this through two lenses again. So first, looking at the progress we've made within our movement, and then looking at the progress in our work. So groups like Encompass and other equity-based organizations have been supporting groups in DEI work so that we can ensure that our movement itself is diverse, equitable, and inclusive. So I do also want to share another short video from Encompass. Sorry that they're so close back to back. This is featuring Encompass founder and ED Aryanish, and she's expressing why and how groups like Encompass are supporting equity efforts for our people in the movement. And I think that this video really perfectly encapsulates that area of work specifically, and then I'll move into some of our outward-facing work from there.
Part of what Encompass is doing is trying to have a conversation with white folks around why caring about these issues should and does impact how we do advocacy for animals. And there is a lot of sensitivity around it, especially because white folks tend to think that they're devoid of race. I started Encompass because it is the right thing to do. If we are a justice-based movement, we have to do right by the people in our cause. And it's also the effective thing to do. We are trying to help organizations understand why diversity, equity, and inclusion should be a part of their bottom line. We need to recognize that we are inherently an ally movement, which means we are by nature advocating for someone else. In this case, we're advocating for non-human animals. We have to understand that advocates are our most precious resource. Even above the donations that we get, the people who are fighting for animals, we have to invest heavily in the culture of our movement and in advocates of color directly, because without that, we're missing a huge opportunity for advancing our cause. We have started working with organizations in giving concrete, practical, operationalized advice in how to take these next few steps, in how to gain that racial literacy and then bring it into action. There are a lot of reasons why people of color can feel alienated in this space. First of all, there's a representation issue because there are so few of us in the movement. It's hard to be one of the first people to say, okay, I'm going to be around people who don't really share my lived experiences. It's really important for people of color to feel like they belong. The animal movement hasn't done a good job historically of putting literature and putting materials out that speak to the authentic experiences of communities of color. In the professional, larger farmed animal protection groups, people of color make up about 9% or so of our movement. When you contrast that by the state of our society, where we are upwards of 40%, and by 2044, we're gonna be 51% people of color, we're missing a large part of our country when we talk about animal issues. The food system is completely laden with institutionalized racism, and that, I think, is really important for us to understand, that the racism we learn about in the textbooks is, yes, maybe something of the past, but the way racism looks and operates today is completely different, and we're trying to help organizations better communicate that. Now is the time to put these concepts into action. We have to make racial equity and racial justice a cornerstone principle in our movement, because if we don't, we risk losing our relevancy. We're trying to help organizations do this work more effectively so that we're not tokenizing people, we're not bringing Black and brown bodies in without valuing their ideas, and helping them do the best work that they can for their communities, and also just do their best work for the movement.
Sorry about that, I was muted. I was just sharing that, over the last few years, we've seen organizations stepping up their commitment to racial equity. And the fact that organizations like Encompass exist and are having this successful impact on how our movement is engaging on these issues is definitely progress to celebrate. I'm going to move into some of the progress in our outward-facing work, though. And so this relates a little bit more to our direct work, our programs, and I want to talk about 3 key areas or themes that have been apparent in how our work has evolved. So these are targeting systems, broadening our ask, and cross-movement building. So for many years, animal advocacy groups have taken a more carceral approach to what we consider a win. And for years, vegans and activists alike have really demonized the people working in animal agriculture systems, from farmers to slaughterhouse workers to meat processing employees. And so we've seen all of these people as part of the system and thus targeted them as the oppressors or perpetrators of cruelty to animals. And undercover investigations done by organizations like MFA, we've documented horrific cruelty and abuse. In a lot of instances, this is just standard practice in factory farming. But in some other instances, there are cases of excessive cruelty. In those cases, groups would often seek legal action against the facilities themselves, but also the workers. And so this has often created this unintentional narrative that big corporations have taken advantage of. And for anyone who has a background in doing direct vegan outreach, you've probably heard, oh, well, that was just that one facility, or that was just one bad apple. When in reality, we know that the industry itself creates the conditions for these instances to occur and become normalized. We also know that these jobs are some of the most dangerous jobs that exist and tend to be located in or near really rural and marginalized communities where fewer job options exist. They often employ low income and people of the global majority who to do the work, and they're often sacrificing their own well-being and safety. They might be reliant on company housing and at risk of deportation. This ends up creating a workforce that is afraid to speak up for their rights, We know this industry puts profits above all. We also see farmers that are beholden to their corporate contracts becoming modern day indentured servants because of the insurmountable debt that they're forced to take on. So workers in all parts of this industry really suffer from being a part of it. They suffer from depression, long-term psychological effects of seeing and taking part in suffering day in and day out. And so we know that, again, the meat industry views animals as really expendable. They view people the same way, and workers are also exploited and victims of this industry. So understanding that factory farming harms people as well, we've seen the start of a shift away from carceral veganism to focus on targeting the institutions, which are the real problem, not the individuals. The second theme that I want to touch on is broadening our ask and broadening our issue here. So another strategic change we've seen, especially from groups like MFA, is an understanding of the need to adjust our messaging and ask in order to be more successful in our campaign. So often, many people working in animal protection do so because we care about animals first. Animal suffering is high on our list of motivating factors of like why we're here. And this has meant that for many years, our work in core messaging has centered around veganism and making direct asks to reduce animal suffering to corporations and legislative bodies. So on the vegan front, this has led to a lot of division in our movement, where veganism is now founded on this unattainable expectation of perfection. It's defined by a standard of purity, and it makes it really less accessible for people to enter our movement, and it hinders our ability to grow. A lot of people who move into activism first start with, becoming vegan, changing their diet. So I think we've begun to try to break this norm a little bit by starting to recognize that progress and incremental change is a good thing. We can create a space where it's okay for people to cut back on products over time, and we can more easily bring people in. And so the same rule really applies for our policy work as well. Often we might need to accept asking for less than what we ultimately want in order to make progress, understanding that every commitment is a building block in creating the food system that we want. So corporate and legislative policy work plays a critical role in reducing suffering while setting up a new norm for how animals are treated and what we will and will not accept as a society. So at times, this may mean that our asks don't even mention animals. And this can feel really counterintuitive to an animal advocate, but we're faced with a reality where we live in a world laden with oppression. We don't like to admit it, but animal welfare is not always on the top of the priority list for decision makers, lawmakers, and the like. So sometimes we do need to speak their language, not ours, to get what we want. And there are so many issues that are connected to animal agriculture that we actually have, the benefit of not needing to be a single issue movement to still work on our mission. An interesting example of this is the recent food procurement bills that Mercy for Animals has been working on, where we're working with government institutions to really influence their food purchasing. A lot of these bills have a climate focus, but ultimately the ask is for the reduction of animal product food purchases as a means to reduce their footprint and better meet some of their climate goals. So when we're speaking about these issues and opportunities, we're usually framing our messaging around that issue, the climate issue, and not necessarily on animal suffering. So even though we don't talk about animal suffering directly, we know that these bills will greatly and really significantly reduce the number of animals killed for food. So a more specific and quick example is that recently the DC Council passed the Green Food Purchasing Amendment of 2020, which established goals for measuring and reducing emissions associated with food and beverages purchased by the district. As we know, food-based emissions are easily lowered by reducing meat and dairy purchases. And through that initiative, an impact analysis report that was actually conducted by DC's Office of Racial Equity also highlighted that greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution disproportionately impacts Black residents, and that the efforts of the bill could potentially improve the health outcomes for Black residents of the district. So the report also noted that due to the health benefits of plant-heavy diets, the bill could also help improve the overall health of residents and has the potential to advance racial equity in the District of Columbia. So really exciting to see that these two things are being interlinked as part of this bill. So as we work on food procurement bills such as this one, we're met with other opportunities to expand on how we can do this work more equitably. And one consideration that we're exploring is maybe even prioritizing local food purchasing to meet the needs of these, these initiatives. If you're interested in learning more about government purchasing power, my colleague Marie, who's our policy specialist, will be on at 1:30 to speak a little bit more about this. The third thing that I wanted to talk about here is cross-movement building. So as we touched on earlier, there's so many interconnected social justice issues that are deeply entwined with our own. So often movements are focused on a single issue and we miss out on opportunities to do more of this cross-movement work. And if we did more of that, it could build more people power for our related causes. So organizations like MFA have been working to really expand on how we think about campaigns and legislative work so that we can draw on these connections and help the general public and other movements understand how they're related. And again, if we join forces, we can make an even larger difference. So one area of work MFA is focusing on, to share an example, is biogas. If you're not familiar with it, biogas is a means to convert waste to energy and primarily involves the breakdown of organic materials to produce biogas. So it does require a digester to process and often also relies on concentrated animal feeding operations, and like large dairy operations, they're seen as a source of this waste to produce biogas. So the meat industry is now using biogas as a profit stream. It's greenwashing their operation. Directed biogas projects really entrench these harmful waste management systems. They exacerbate adverse effects of the system and really discourages the investment in superior technologies. Also, they ignore environmental concerns, the impact of natural disasters on surrounding communities. And we know, again, that communities located closest to CAFOs tend to be low income and communities of color. So BIPGM folks are really disproportionately harmed already, and biogas projects only add to these risks. So in several states, these bills are proposing the construction of new projects, which requires like a maze of pipelines to be built, leading CAFOs to processing facilities. In other states, we're seeing this in the form of, some impact related to carbon credits, from manure to energy projects to offset emissions rather than directly reducing emissions. So groups like MFA, again, have joined efforts of many local and environmental justice groups who are working on these issues. And again, this is an issue that doesn't center on animal suffering, but we know that if these bills continue to pass, they will further entrench these systems and further harm animals. And another quick example of cross-movement building is with labor and human rights organizations to address harms of the workers in the meat industry. So during the pandemic, we saw that slaughterhouses were becoming COVID-19 hotspots. Workers were being denied sick time. They didn't have protective gear. They didn't have adequate social distancing measures. Paired with increased line speeds that we were seeing at the time, there was really greatly increased risk of worker injuries and higher risk that animals could be killed while still conscious. So we actually worked on a campaign called Meat Free in Solidarity. We partnered with over 120 other workers' rights, food justice, racial justice, farmer health, consumer safety, and animal welfare, environmental as well, and animal welfare organizations to collectively hold the meat industry accountable to their actions. We had a week of actions against Tyson, demanding that they enact measures to protect workers, slow down line speeds, halt their lobbying efforts to get line speed waivers, and things like that. So these types of coalition efforts allow us to take a collective stand against big meat companies who profit from the exploitation of animals, workers, and the planet. So by collaborating and building this cross-movement capacity, building these relationships, we can really start to build people power to fight against big ag while addressing multiple issues related to factory farming at once. So looking forward, there's a lot of exciting opportunities that we can pursue, and it's really promising to see the direction that a lot of groups are heading, and that, I think we have been making a lot of exciting progress. There's still a lot to learn. So let's talk about what this work looks like as we move forward, both within our movement and then also in our broader programmatic work. So we'll start looking at within our movement first. So as I mentioned earlier, Encompass recently worked with Equity-Based Dialogue for Inclusion to conduct a State of the Movement report, appropriately called Voices of the Movement Toward an Equitable Farmed Animal Protection Movement. So as part of this report, EBDI, that's short for Equity-Based Dialogue for Inclusion, EBDI presented 7 recommendations for individuals, funders, and orgs doing this work based on their findings. And their recommendations are categorized in 3 key areas. So first is acknowledgement, then reconciliation, and then last is action. So their first recommendation is to identify, address, and work to eliminate exclusionary practices and racism in the movement. They suggest that we approach movement building by viewing the diversity of experiences and strategies within the movement as an asset. We should reconsider and expand our view on what makes for effective advocacy. So in summary, viewing the diversity of backgrounds, experiences, and ways that we can protect animals in the movement collectively as an asset can ultimately improve our efficacy as a movement. And it can also address the exclusionary aspects of the culture that we've seen for a long time. And in this portion, one of the respondents that they surveyed had said, quote, "I think historically the farmed animal protection movement has been a single issue movement with a very poor ability to think multidimensionally about power and privilege." So to begin making inroads with BIPGM-led organizations and groups, it'll be really important for, what we kind of consider the mainstream movement or like well-funded movement to embrace these organizations on their terms with respect for their work, including work that might not be directly related to non-human animals. The second recommendation that came out of the report was to recognize BIPGM-led entities as peers and equals in this space to build bridges with BIPGM-led grassroots organizations. So what we see is, the larger well-funded sector of the movement is perceived to be predominantly white in composition and culture. So we should be actively working to build bridges and form partnerships with BIPGM-led orgs, particularly those that work in BIPGM communities. Again, we're not really in those communities right now, right? So this will diversify and expand the reach of the movement. So making progress on racial equity in the farmed animal protection movement is not only a moral imperative, but a survival imperative for the ongoing and continued success of the movement. That was one line that really stuck out to me from the report, that if we want to continue to thrive and succeed in our work, we have to be doing this work. The third recommendation is to acknowledge the harms that BIPGM have experienced and continue to experience in the movement. So further acknowledge that these harms are a direct result of racism, unconscious biases, and practices that marginalize and exclude BIPGM. So a lot of activists in our movement, specifically BIPGM activists, have experienced harm and exclusion in this space, in the past and still to this day. And their efforts to incorporate racial equity and justice into the movement have been dismissed in a lot of cases. And this has really created this feeling of distrust, alienation. And so these negative experiences of BIPGM folks in the movement really have to be acknowledged, right? The amends must be made in order for us to be able to move forward and to heal and to grow. So we see that the process of recognizing inequity where it exists is really the beginning of accountability. The fourth recommendation is to move into the reconciliation stage. So engage in a facilitated dialogue about racial equity to develop understanding, trust, healing, and to ultimately build bridges with BIPGM members of the movement who have experienced harm. So very similar to what I just said, we have to accept and address this. So a lot of respondents to the report mentioned that they really want to improve DEIJ in their organizations given the harm and exclusion that they've witnessed or personally experienced. Strengthening partnerships with BIPGM-led groups, acknowledging harms, making amends, having really honest and vulnerable dialogue, all create this foundation for a stronger movement. So these actions can really expand the horizons of white activists and give BIPGM activist spaces to heal and really build those bridges again and build that trust up that had been, in the past sort of broken. sorry, I'm going a little bit quickly because I know I'm running out of time. The fifth one here is to recognize human exploitation in animal agriculture and the opportunity for collaboration with those humans exploited or otherwise directly harmed by animal agriculture. So we've talked about this now a lot earlier as, progress is happening here. So recognizing animal oppression as part of a larger system, one that disproportionately harms by PGM folks, means seeing, these workers as potential allies in our fight for liberation rather than oppressors. So as I mentioned, in those instances where we really collaborated with other movements, for that one initiative, we were working with 120 other non-animal protection groups. And that could really, again, have the potential for building really exceptional power to do our work. So moving into the action stage now, the sixth recommendation is to track social identities of staff and board members to identify inequity in organizational makeup. So we know that collecting demographic data will help organizations start to gain some insight into, who's in their organization, who might be left out. And the hope is that over time, the data will allow organizations and the movement as a whole to kind of understand composition relative to like our global population. As you saw in the video from Encompass, we don't match the global representation of, racial makeup, for instance. And this can kind of be a benchmark once we start tracking data, and it'll ultimately help us really attract, retain and promote staff and volunteers that have an array of different social identities. And the final recommendation that came from the Voices of the Movement report is to evolve funding practices and broaden our understanding of effectiveness to distribute greater funds to BiPGM-led organizations. So earlier, I kind of talked about, the mainstream animal protection movement. And really what I meant was, the well-funded groups that have a little bit more visibility and higher profiles. So some funders and well-funded organizations have started some initiatives to re-grant and redistribute and reallocate funds a little bit more equitably towards Black and Brown-led groups. The process should be expanded to really explore different concepts of effectiveness that really include these aspects and include BiPGM-led groups that are working on this issue and related issues. So in all, maybe we can share the report link out after the presentation, but this report's really meant to be a starting point. It's a baseline for us to begin tracking progress, to use it as a guide in directing our work so that we know how we can do this more effectively and really better invest in DEI work. So we can also use a similar lens to drive our outward facing work as well. So a lot of this, again, was kind of centered on the internal state of our movement. And so as we're looking at external work, it would be really important for us to bring a lot of these concepts and recommendations into an impact analysis. So this is something that, a framework, for example, that Mercy for Animals is beginning to use. We're kind of testing this right now, where, as we start looking at strategies and plans for outward facing work, we're trying to implement an equity impact analysis to consider a few key questions before we just launch into a campaign, an action, or a project. So you want to start this process by developing an analysis that includes a set of key questions. So these questions might touch on some of the recommendations shared by Encompass in the Voices of the Movement report. They can also contain other questions that your organization might find useful. And during planning stages of a new initiative, conduct your analysis, assessing questions that might be like, who's impacted by this project or action, how we included them in the conversation and how we included them in our planning. Will we be compensating them for their effort and time? How will those impacted communities actually be affected? Like, what will that look like? How might they perceive this action or initiative? Here, it's important to remember that, groups and communities are not monoliths. You want to assess questions like, does this action attempt to correct existing disparities or inequity? Could it potentially worsen them? What resources are we allocating to support this action? And from there, you can develop your action plan to either correct or revise your strategy and tactics based on this assessment. You'll want to make sure that your actions and adjustments are really clear to ensure that you can mitigate potential issues that arose during the assessment and move forward in the work effectively. And then third is, in addition to having a revised plan, now having been through this analysis, you want to make sure you have a method of tracking progress and opportunities to reassess if there are future revisions that might be needed once you start engaging in the work. So there should be systems of accountability. Whoops. Sorry about that. There should be systems of accountability in place to maintain equity throughout your initiative or your project or your campaign, and a system for you to pivot if needed. So in thinking about this impact analysis, you can remember the 3 A's: analysis, action, and accountability. So hopefully you have found some of this to be helpful in thinking about how you might implement some of the recommendations of the Voices of the Movement report, and in assessing the potential impact of your work through an equity-based lens. That is all that I had for you. I totally sped through that because there's a lot of content. So thank you for bearing with me here.
Thank you, Shayna. That was quite the inspiring presentation, and I think it definitely textured the ways in which and I hope the rest of the audience will think about advancing equity in our work and institutions moving forward. You provided a lot of really helpful concrete strategies, which was awesome. So speaking of inspiration, I think we have time for a couple of questions. What inspired you to get into animal advocacy and community organizing? Maybe just to start off.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I, like a lot of people, I started off by going vegan. Actually started off by going vegetarian years ago when I was in high school because I saw a campaign from an animal protection organization. So again, I think a lot of us really enter into this path first by, learning about the issue, changing our diets, and then kind of really expanding from there, which is why that vegan piece, always has some sort of a place in our work. But I really struggled with it. It took me years. I flip-flopped back and forth. I was like a really unhealthy vegetarian. I ate like pizza and French fries, and didn't have a sense of community. I grew up in a really rural part of New Jersey. And so I didn't really stick with it. And I was able to really disconnect from the issue through the years. I actually found myself working in the fashion industry after college. And so I was working with a lot of like leather goods, for instance. And I can't really pinpoint like a pivotal moment, but I definitely had a like, what am I doing moment where I think like I was like, working with leather and all of a sudden realizing that like here I'm creating harm, and I was looking for groups to get involved with and reached out to a bunch of groups. I was like, let me just start volunteering and see where I can go from there. A couple groups gave me the same ask. They said, go out and leaflet, which, in New York, you're like, oh my gosh, that's so scary. Like everyone gets annoyed by people trying to give you things. And so I was sort of like, okay, like that's a lot because, I've never done any advocacy before. But there are 2 different groups that gave me the same ask. And the difference is that one of them said, you know what, let me introduce you to Jim. Jim is an organizer in your area, and he's got an event coming up where you can go join him and leaflet with other folks in the area. The other group mailed me leaflets for me to like do my own thing. I hate saying this thinking about waste. I never used the other leaflets that were sent to me, but I did go meet Jim and I met other people doing this work. And I found a sense of community that I had never had before. And it helped to further push me in the right direction. And I went vegan after that. So I kind of started animal advocacy first, but I realized that it's so important that we have community and we have people to work with. And I ended up feeling really motivated by this idea that like, here we are, a group, we have collective power in sharing this message, spreading awareness, and doing this work. And so that really built my interest in community organizing as well. And I will say that the group that connected me to Jim was Mercy for Animals. And so, that really solidified my journey as a vegan and an activist.
Awesome. Yeah, and kind of on the topic of community and organizing, I know you talked a lot about your efforts through both Mercy for Animals and Encompass, especially within the legislative realm. So kind of relatedly, what have some of your most successful organizing events been, maybe personally too, in addition to your nonprofit work? And maybe why do you think they were so successful?
Yes. I could be biased because I'm feeling the energy coming off of, thinking about a lot of this progress that we've made. And I'll admit that, we're making a lot of progress in building inroads, but not all of those campaigns have been successful. But in terms of, and I should say, they haven't been successful in terms of, securing a win. But in my opinion, for example, like the biogas work that I mentioned, I actually see that as really successful organizing in that we didn't win, right? We opposed that bill and it ended up passing. But I think that we started building relationships with coalitions that are really deeply ingrained in this work. And it helped us begin to understand like what role can we play in doing cross-movement work. And so we really learned a lot from that. And I think that, our legislative work that our government affairs and public policy team is doing, they've really invested a lot of time and care in building these relationships, joining these coalitions that don't have an animal protection focus in an effort to advance animal issues. So it's not always in a way that centers our work, but I actually think that this is such a critical path forward in how we do our work, how we grow our movement, that, I see those as really, really great successes because we have the grounds to work with all of these groups again and to continue building on that momentum.
Thank you. So I think we're out of time for any more questions, but I just want to ask whether you would be willing to answer questions that anyone might email to you or provide through some other communication means.
Yeah, absolutely. I can share my email in the chat box. It's just my first name, last initial at Mercy for Animals. And I would be really happy to answer any questions that folks share either now or, through any other means.
Wonderful. It was such a pleasure to hear you speak, and I think your presentation is really invaluable at this moment. So thank you again for coming to the symposium.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for the great work that everyone here is doing.